Hello and welcome to the case study session, Procurement Priorities in a Post-COVID World, hosted by Bonfire. My name is Justin. I will be the moderator during our time together. Today's session is brought to you 100% virtually using the Zoom platform. So before we kick off, let's review some admin details. This year, we've expanded the NIGP virtual forum with more live workshop sessions. And during today's sessions, participants are invited to raise their hands, unmute, and ask questions. Take note of the hand raise feature, which will let me and our speakers know you would like to share. And remember, please be sure to unmute yourself before sharing commentary or a question. During the session, you may also, please be sure to unmute yourself before sharing commentary or a question. During the session, you may also submit questions to the chat box on your screen, and we will take them throughout the session. This probably goes without saying, but please only use the chat for relevant professional discussions or tech issues. Our presenters today are Omar Salemi, Rachel Friesen, Michael Brinton, Jennifer Freites. Rachel, would you like to go ahead and get us started?
Perfect, thank you. And I'm actually going to share my video, which is a verbal but visual cue for the rest of the panelists. I'll also share their video. So Jennifer and Michael as well when you have a moment. On that note, I'm going to piggyback off of what Justin said in a moment as far as questions and engagement. But of course, as he highlighted, today's focus entitled this session is Procurement Priorities in a Post-COVID World, Back to Business, Fast and Focused. And obviously we thematically learned a few things from the Fast and Furious here, but in this case, we're hoping for not a sequel pandemic-wise. So on that note as well, we'll go right into the agenda before I really wanted to spend some time highlighting who you're here to see and learn from, which is our panelists today. So today we'll really focus on how did we get here. I'll explain in a moment the studies and the data that it substantiated this panel, because it is a panel, therefore you will be learning from the panelists, but you'll also be seeing a range of graphs and informational visuals in front of you as well. So I want to make sure you're all aware of where those come from. On that note, we'll look at procurement this year, what's happening, how do we get here, what changes have the panelists seen, and then we'll go futuristic because we have the perfect panel for that. What does the future look like for public procurement? On that note as well, we weren't joking there, as to Justin's point, we really want this to be an informative and engaging setting. So we have set up the Zoom so that you can submit your questions in the chat. I will be looking at those here and there. My support team, such as Justin and Angela on our marketing side, will be poking me if a question is really relevant or topical at the moment. But my goal is that I insert your questions, not just at the end, but throughout today's dialogue. So I really encourage yourself to submit those in typing, or if you prefer to take the mic, for lack of a better word, I'll also unmute you and you can have your question anytime. So we'll get right into the panelists and the introductions. So we got a high level overview of the names, of course, but just to start off, to give context as well, we have Jennifer Freites, who is the Chief Procurement Officer for Barnstable County and the President of the Cape Cod Association of Public Procurement Officials. Welcome, Jennifer. On that note, we have Michael Brinton, who is the Assistant Director at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in San Francisco. He is responsible for the procurement, contracting, risk management, and compliance. Additionally, he serves as the Title VI Civil Rights Officer for the agency. Welcome, Michael. And finally, to round out the panel, we have Omar Salemi, who is the CEO of Bonfire. Having worked with hundreds of public procurement agencies to bring their procurement operations online, Omar believes that procurement teams are strategic drivers within their organizations, and he is passionate about enabling those professionals for success with technology. Welcome, Omar. Welcome, Omar. On that note, too, for a high-level moment about myself, my name is Rachel Friesen. I support our client experience function here at Bonfire, where we serve over 500 public agencies in not only bringing their public procurement process online, but our goal is also to enhance their process with our tool going forward. And I will say, all of these three panelists have either put up with me as they're either my boss in Omar's case, or I supported their agency once upon a time. So I know Michael is Mike, but I'll keep formal for this panel if you prefer Michael. Okay, we'll continue on. So before we get into the meat and potatoes and the questions, for context, of course, as I mentioned, we will be looking at some bar graphs and visuals. We support at Bonfire over 500 public agencies, as I highlighted. So what that means is in 6-month cycles, we really do analyze the data of our organization's purchasing efforts. So for example, are there opportunity volumes changing year over year? Are the types of opportunities changing? And what thematically are we seeing from the organizations we support? So everything you're seeing in front of you in the slides as well today are both from our literal database of data alongside poll feedback that we receive from webinars like this that we will do with our client base. So they're really married together. So we're looking from 2019 into 2021 for this panel. Some topics that thematically came out that we'll speak to, of course, are vendor diversity, respending public procurement dollars after there was a freeze prior last year. In addition to that, a new level of criticality that we're seeing from our agencies of their online tools and of their online software stacks. Now, I wasn't kidding when I said we're going to be engaged today. So actually, we're going to go into a poll right away. So sorry if you sat too far back. I'm going to ask for your participation in a moment. You'll see a poll come up on your screen. So coming out of the initial COVID-19 emergency response, what has been your team's biggest priority in 2021? We're going to leave this open for a moment. And I love, again, if those of you who write other, if you do want to comment in the chat, I'll get in a moment to some of the panelists' feedback on our responses. But we will leave it open. I'm just looking at the results coming in. Spoiler, actually, no, a couple. I was about to say no one put other, but now we have a couple. So I'm looking forward to seeing what comes in now. Keep it open for another few seconds, please, Justin.
Yeah, we'll give everybody about 5 more seconds. And here are results.
Perfect. So we can see that the majority, increasing speed, efficiency of our process. That was a theme that's coming out of this poll. In addition to that, about 11% behind that, we had reevaluating. That was a theme that I mentioned just now, came out of our research. And then soon after, developing infrastructure for work from home. I know Jennifer's passionate about that topic, so I'll have to hear her feedback on that soon too. Great, thanks for sharing. Justin, and if you could just close the results there. Hopefully you can all see my screen, but if not, we'll figure that out in a moment. Okay, perfect. So what you can see on this slide, we did notice a dip, of course. This is probably a surprise to no one, of the opportunities that were run in 2020 relative to what we saw on the platform that is Bonfire in 2019. But before we go into that, thematically too, Omar, did you have any thoughts on the polls that we just ran at all, or any opinions on what you saw there?
No, it was actually kind of similar to what we've seen in the past, where there's a big focus shifting onto modernization, speeding things up. And I think it was spurred by the pandemic and working from home. And I know we'll talk about this a lot in the next few questions. So I'll reserve my comments for then.
Okay, perfect. And we did have a comment from Kristen, thank you, that there was also a focus for her team of going back to the emergency response. And there is still a PPE shortage, I should say. Okay, perfect. So we'll start with yourself, Mike. What do you think about the findings on the screen in front of us? Do they resonate with you? Are you ramping up your efforts, or the types of opportunities that you're running now, for example, that are different than a year ago?
Yeah, this is consistent with what we went through. We're most of ours were really kind of delays in how the public health orders, impacted what work could go on. We didn't really cancel any projects, but we did delay a few. It's hard to go out and do, travel pattern polls when your ridership's down 90%. So certain things like that with the health pandemic. But for the most part, with my agency being transportation, we seem to be a little bit recession proof. So it kind of makes sense that we ramp up coming out of this because there's money being spent on infrastructure. So.
No, very fair, very good context there. How about for yourself, Jennifer? What are your thoughts? And you're opposite side of the country and very different scope than Mike. So.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the results, it definitely resonates with everything that occurred last year, but we were definitely looking at the speed and efficiency for our process. And, with the county, work just continued on. So, we still had projects that we still had to get done, even though a lot of our town halls were closed. The DPW still had projects that they had to maintain, roads still had to be maintained, everything still had to be done. So I actually saw an increase in projects in the past year, which was pretty interesting. I think I kept on saying we're in the middle of a pandemic and somehow we're working more than ever. So it was very interesting for sure.
Yeah, well, fair enough. Everyone justified their function and their roles. So, so that was very evident. And then we did see, for example, an increase in RFPs as well across public procurement. So we're going to focus a little bit on this question of like the dynamics between vendors and procurement teams. How did yourselves, start with you this time, Jennifer, believe that the pandemic changed the way that your team and your suppliers work together?
So I think we just were able to work a lot more efficiently. So previously when we had in-person bids, it was a lot more time consuming. Vendors were always worried if it was going to make it on time. We have quite a few buildings in our complex. So unfortunately, it was very common for bid packages, luckily to be time stamped, but arriving at the incorrect building, which can be frustrating. And, who's to say it was really received at that time? So we'd have to get documentation and whatnot. So it just became a lot more frustrating. And then when the pandemic hit, vendors reached out to me personally and were just so grateful that they never had to put something in the mail again, that they can just straight from their office, wherever that might be, were able to submit proposals in such an easy way. So they were grateful. I got a lot of positive feedback from that.
Yeah, that validation is key too. That's great. What about for yourself, Mike? Is there anything you'd like to highlight for your dynamic between your team and your suppliers?
As far as the move to like e-procurement or that type of interaction, Bonfire was really one of our first transitions to that. So we had been starting this process pre-pandemic for years. And luckily we were kind of finished turning everything on in terms of like workflow, electronic routing, Bonfire, like right before the pandemic. But what I feel like I've seen is that we've actually been able to work more closely. It's more cooperative because, in our region, we have 9 counties and each of them with their own public health orders. And it appeared that they tried to coordinate those health orders together so they were similar, but everything was fast and furious. So I feel like we worked better with our vendors. And as far as, Zoom and digital meetings and removing the in-person, I agree with Jennifer. We've been it reduces costs for our vendors, right? They don't have to travel. We're not doing, hard paper copies of proposals or things like that. So I think it's actually improved and allowed us to actually get more firms to participate and compete because there's less of a barrier to entry or a cost hurdle they need to get over as far as participating.
Oh, that's great. Okay, we'll get into vendor participation more too throughout this panel. On that note, Omar, I'm curious to see your insights too, just broadly from all the organizations, that we support at Bonfire. Like, how do you believe that procurement has shifted from administrative to a more strategic role, for example, this year?
Yeah, and I think I'll just echo what was said earlier in terms of that shift to using different platforms and just digitization, modernization. COVID definitely catalyzed that shift. It was due to a sudden need that we had. And so we've heard this over and over again with procurement teams that wanted to modernize, but they couldn't, but now they had like a really good reason to shift. And those platforms end up shaving, hours and hours of time, whether it's something like, even like DocuSign, not having to chase a document around, and how much time that would save for a procurement organization. And then if we look at just like the evaluation process, right? If you had to do this in Excel, having to create the Excel sheet, distribute it to evaluators, take it back, compile it, have the meeting, and all of that being like happening automatically with the platform, again, would save hours of time. And so what do you do with the extra time? And what you end up doing, and this is what we hear all the time from our clients, is now you have time for market research, you have time for scoping and drafting better RFPs, negotiation, initiate these diversity initiatives that we're going to be talking about. And so all of that allows you just the headspace and the opportunity to start tackling these larger projects instead of doing things that, quite frankly, computers are really good at doing. So again, it was the catalyst, and that's what we're seeing, that shift more in 2021, I would say, than previous years.
No, that's great. Okay, we'll move on to work from home, a topic that has come under considerable scrutiny over the last while. My assumption is most of those here on the panel are working not in the office, although Michael might just have an outstanding house, I'm not sure. So how often, you can see here, this is in the poll, like, do you expect to be working from home? And it was actually about 50%. You can see assumed that they would be 100% work from the office. So that was kind of interesting that they thought they would go completely back to the office. But we did see, I think, for example, in my notes, over another 50%, if you think about this in the inverse relationship, anticipated in some capacity, they'd be working from home. So it's kind of a bit of a split bag there to a degree. So let's talk about this for a few moments. So Jennifer, for yourself, what is your reality at this time? Are you working from home?
So at this time, ever since we implemented Bonfire, I've been working 100% from home. I'm still 100% from home while we're coming up with a telecommuting policy. But from what I've been told, because I've been able to continue county business and do everything and then some that needed to get done, they're really looking at keeping me 100% remote. I think if anything, I will fit maybe into that purple bar there and maybe work most of the time from home and have to at least show up every once in a while. But it looks like, and for the public sector, that's huge because there was such a stigma for so long that, people who work from home aren't necessarily productive. And I think we've all proved them wrong. So.
No, very fair. How about yourself, Michael? What is your reality? And also, maybe what your preferences are too. You're welcome if you'd like to share that.
Sure. And Mike's fine, Rachel. Hey, you even works.
I'm interchanging a little, so thank you. Okay, great.
Sorry, just one.
Oh, I think he's just changing audio.
One of the downsides of working from home is all the noises. It's not as quiet as it is in an office. I'd say that our entire agency is going to be falling in those first three bars, of from 100% to home to 50% from home. We also went through the same thing. You have older school, longer term government people that were like, no, you have to be in the office. And now this is proven that, everything's fine. We're actually working better. So we're going to this buzz phrase called hybrid. The agency's trying to work out where, I have a feeling they're going to give us really ultimate flexibility of, if you want to work from home, if you can. But where it's leading us to is I used to sit right about where my forehead is. I have an office, so this is a background picture of the inside of our building. And so now it leads to, all right, do we really need this large of a building? Do we need this much space? It's, as you go to hybrid now, there's all these other questions of, where does workers' comp start and stop? Where does ergo start and stop for people at home? So it's interesting, but, coming to a conclusion that we're going to be allowed to work from home is just going to open up a whole bunch of other fun challenges we get to tackle. But I have a feeling my agency is going to be definitely more remote work than not.
Oh, that's great to hear. And I was going to say, I believe, unless it was a mistake, Gary Chavez from New Mexico raised his hand. So Gary, why don't you unmute yourself? I'll ask you to unmute and you can ask your question.
Okay, well, I was actually going to comment, and hello everyone from the land of enchantment from New Mexico. We have found it to be a little bit more beneficial working from home and more productive. The only thing that we find is we're no longer an 8 to 5 group. Once you get up in the morning, you're going to receive emails, and before you go to bed, you're going to receive emails up to 8 o'clock, 8:30 at night. But it has cut down, I believe, in the social visiting in the offices. We are back in the office 50% of the time. So out of an 80-hour pay period, we're back 40 hours. So I do have my staff going in 3 and 2 days a week during the week. But we found that we can be more productive. We can do our work from, I'm not going to say it, but from the golf course. But we are able to be more functional and more attentive, I guess, to make sure that we are being responsible at our workstations, if it be from home or from the office. But I find it to be more productive. And our supervisors, our bosses have found it to be more productive also to work from home.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Gary. I know Mike wants to cap off of what you're saying too. He just raised his hand.
Yeah, and you know that you're one of the things I think you initially were commenting on about the managing expectations in your hours. I mean, I think in this, as we move into this new remote world, as managers of people, it's on us to ensure that they're not overworking themselves and that you do create appropriate boundaries, you know, around responsiveness, or, you know, I don't need you to work nights and weekends. I actually don't want you to turn your phone off, or things like that. So, I mean, that'll be an interesting challenge too, to see how management adjusts to what's happening.
No, very true. Hopefully we'll get to some more tactics as we evolve too. Actually, you know, on that note, Omar, sometimes you want to maybe speak to this a little bit. So as organizations potentially return to office, are there practices or technologies that you believe were employed or you saw employed during remote work that you believe are advantageous and should be continued to use in the future? Strategies, tactics, tools. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's we certainly invested in a lot of tools ourselves to enable the work from home. There's a whole bunch that we can talk about. So to Gary's point and Mike's, I think there's a cultural shift that we're going through still. Like the first cultural shift was to work from home and get that to be acceptable and build that trust. I think we're there. We've shown it now for a year and a half. Now the other shift is going to happen. And how do we integrate in a hybrid work environment those who are not working in the office with the ones who are? How do we have a meeting? And obviously it'll have to be like a Zoom style meeting. Like we can't just have a split meeting anymore. And so there's a whole bunch of things that I think will be worked out over the next little period. From our perspective, immediately we had to do some things like approvals process. We have to actually get that to be baked into a platform that can be tracked. And we had to get VPNs and just security protocols had to be really upped, considering that people are going to be remote. For example, like you can't take a Bonfire laptop and use it from another country. We will shut down that traffic. You just can't access it. So we had to do a lot of work on the infrastructure side as well, and actually inspired us to do our own work within Bonfire as well to enable remote work. One of those being the approval platform that we just launched. And so it was kind of our own experience. And then a lot of our customers saying, we no longer have, you know, somebody knocking on the door and saying, hey, can you get this done? Can you get this intake request? Now you have to actually do a formal process for that. And so we started working on internal tools for our clients as well.
That's great. On that note too, we'll start with yourself, Mike. Sometimes it's come into question, remote work may impact your team's ability to be audit ready or comply with regulations. Do you believe, or have you seen strategies that teams need to follow to ensure you are compliant with regulations to be, let's say, audit ready?
You know, I think that from that standpoint, what I'm finding is from an audit perspective, where it becomes challenging is when you have multiple platforms that you use, right? So we have Bonfire for our procurement needs. We have another software system that we use for like a database of our contracts and workflow tracking to track approvals, et cetera. So you have these multiple different systems. I don't necessarily think it's easier than it was in person, but you also have to be aware of trying to cut corners or skip steps. You know, digitally, it can be easy to kind of move around or skip something that you might be doing that might impact that audit trail. So it's just, right now, at least for my agency, I'm not as worried about it because like I said, we had been going through a transition to digital working over the past 5 years or so. So we were kind of more moving along that line anyways, but I can definitely see it. I mean, especially for an agency that was potentially relying on paper and had to really quickly shift to digital, you know, having record retention tools in place or just all of it, it really is challenging. If we had to do everything that we did to move to a digital platform within the past 18 months, I would have had a bigger forehead than I do now. I would have lost more hair along the way. So.
No, very fair. What about yourself, Jennifer? Did anything that Mike say there resonated with you, or what were strategies you felt as though your team had to deploy to be audit ready?
I mean, I'll piggyback a little bit off of what Mike said, but we do have the same kind of situation where we have multiple platforms. We were, I would say, the last piece that probably wasn't digitized at this point really was procurement. We had, everything else, purchase orders. We were just putting in place vendor self-service so vendors could onboard themselves into our financial system, workflows, approvals. We had intake for certain tasks. Then I had to add in kind of an intake for bid requests because, way back when it was just show up at, Jen's desk and and let me know what you needed. So it was that sort of thing. So definitely had to go to a more intake type of process. But I know for me, it's definitely been a lot more efficient since I've implemented it. It's been great to just get all that information in, one spot and one location instead of going back and forth, in emails and, do you want an in-person meeting, pre-bid meeting? How much is this going to cost? All that information is on the intake. It's been great. So definitely I would say that, for auditing purposes, granted, like I said before, it's difficult to go from one platform to the next to kind of see that beginning to end, but it's doable.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Omar, what Jennifer and Mike have spoken to, do you see those, what they mentioned, thematically represented in the public agencies that you support at Bonfire?
Yeah, I think it's depending on when your adoption journey was or where you were on the adoption journey. So like Mike, has been customer for a long time. I know you guys were very comfortable in that. Some had to shift right away. But I would say those who had to shift right away ended up in a similar spot. They probably had to go through a little bit more stress during the pandemic, having to pivot their process. But I think what Jen and Mike that spoke to that is true across the board is more and more organizations are using best in breed technology to do what they want to do really quickly, as opposed to implementing like a behemoth software solution that does it all and takes like 3 years to implement and nobody likes to use. And so I think that nimble approach is definitely the way to go, at least in my unbiased opinion. But also leads to quick results that you can see the results of right away. And then you can start connecting these platforms together over time so they can kind of act like a big behemoth without having to pay for that price. So that is a common thing that we're seeing as well, Rachel.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. We highlighted, I believe, Mike, it was yourself for this next question. You highlighted that you had an increase in your vendor pool, I believe, with going online, your supplier network. Do you believe, I'm just curious, would you equate that to just going online? Because the question I wanted to frame to the panel was, has working remotely impacted your vendor reach or the diversity of the suppliers you work with? You mentioned that like outcome for your team. Mike, do you think it was, is it oversimplification to say it was online tools, or what do you think those outcomes are generated from?
I think it's a combination. Like we were discussing a few minutes ago, I do believe that it's much more cost efficient, to participate in a Bonfire process, for procurement, where it's all digital. You have a Zoom-based proposers conference or Zoom-based interviews. You eliminate travel expenses. You eliminate the preparation. I think it's easy as to be on this side where I'm asking for people to give me proposals to forget how much cost and resources go into preparing them. And so being able to have a digital platform that saves them some costs, that's maybe a little bit more transparent, and speeds up the process, that also allows them to hopefully move on from that investment and resource in the process to get to contractor to move on to the next one. From a diversity perspective, it's kind of hard because we've been making a larger shift or focus into diversity and equity independent of the pandemic. So we've had a lot of these initiatives that have been kind of building. And so I can't really equate our increase in the diversity of our vendors like a one-to-one. It's exactly because of this, but I definitely think, we've been putting more attention to it, trying to bring in more diversity in our vendor mix, and that it's digital and more cost effective and efficient for them to participate, I think also helps.
Right. No, fair enough. There's a range of efforts. taking place on your organization's side. Now, neither of yourselves, Jennifer or Mike, maybe you did in other ways. It doesn't come across that you made a scramble to, take on board an online purchasing tool necessarily through the pandemic. You weren't going from paper to nothing. So you're already ahead in a modernization approach. But are there practices or tools that you did put in place during the mandatory, like there's no other option, work from home period, that you've had to reevaluate, whether it's, lack of scalability or due to security or your stakeholders' feedback? We'll start with yourself, Jennifer.
Not that I can think of. I mean, we were able to implement it quickly. There wasn't really, it was probably one of the best implementations I've had on such short notice. And, especially in the middle of a pandemic, we had to get business continuity up and running. So no, I can't, nothing really comes to mind, unfortunately.
No, that's the dream, no Band-Aid solutions.
Not at all.
For yourself, Mike, and again, it can be across the scope of your team's efforts too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I mean, of course, relying on Zoom meetings or we have made more efficient use of like SharePoint based, document preparation where you're all working off of the same document rather than emailing attachments around, and version control has gotten a little bit easier, more focused on. But most of the systems we are relying on in the pandemic period were systems that we were already implemented or were implementing. I do know that I am. It's funny. I would imagine Omar and Rachel, you guys are probably seeing this. Slow to adopt government agencies, slow to move to the digital world. But then once we're there, we're like, we want everything. You need to make your system do everything we want it to do right when we want it to do it, and you're taking too long. So, I don't want a big ERP system, but I would love a system that my procurement and contracting efforts and workflow and approvals could all live and breathe in one system. That would be like my next goal for my agency to arrive at something like that. But yeah, no, we're already using everything that we're doing. It's just getting used to working digitally. I'm tired of looking at myself. I know I can turn off the video, but it's like, then I can't really pay attention. Am I looking at the right place? So, but having to stare at myself all day long, that's one thing I am not enjoying about remote work.
No, very fair. And I would echo what you said. There is that interesting level of, you go 0 to 1, and then you want to go, 1 to 1,000 overnight a little bit with teams. They have a new level of expectation of their tools, but you're not alone. We did see that as a theme coming out of even what we saw in the surveys that I'm surfacing the data from today. But I think Omar and I could have been potentially predictive on that outcome regardless. The criticality was always there. It's just been that much more enhanced, if anything. Okay, we'll continue on. So now we'll be focusing on the amount of hands on deck, for lack of a better word, like stakeholders involved for opportunities per agency. So we did actually see in this year, 2021, the number of buyers or purchasing specialists, procurement agents did bounce back, for lack of a better word, rising about 50% over the last year. So that's a 44% increase in procurement buyers leveraging procurement software between the years of 2019 and 2021. So Jennifer, you highlighted project volume or opportunity volume already today. How has your team prioritized incoming requests during this increased demand, I should say? Mm-hmm.
How are we addressing it?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Well, so we to kind of add a lot more stakeholders to it as well. So we have, as part of the county, we do a lot of cooperative bids for the 15 towns that may not have procurement folks, dedicated procurement folks in each one of the towns. So they were able to kind of sign on to Bonfire and be able to see the projects firsthand. So I definitely had a lot more stakeholder involvement, and even internally with all of my different departments, a lot more were involved in the process this time in the past year than previously. So.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'll ask you a little bit more on that in a moment. Anything on your end that you wanted to highlight, Mike, as far as how your teams prioritize the various incoming requests and project volume as a whole?
Yeah, we had we had lost 3 people about 3 or 4 years ago, and my agency didn't let me replace them. And now it's funny how 3 years later, they let me hire on 3 people, but they wanted to act as if they were all new employees, and I should be so excited. I'm like, yeah, but you made me whole. But no, we've increased our staff size. Using the tools that between Bonfire and another system that we use, we've been able to coordinate, making sure we're monitoring workload, shifting workload around, so that no one's completely overburdened. One of the things that we've also done, we're a regional agency, so we cover 9 counties. And within that 9 counties, there's, I think, 116 jurisdictions between towns and counties. And they all are they've been much more challenged through this pandemic than my agency has. And so we've made an effort to make sure our procurements are available for cooperative use or piggybacking by other jurisdictions within our agency. So like our benches, other cities can use that to satisfy their procurement policies and then just go straight into contract. And we've been trying to educate our jurisdictions about that, like reaching out to them saying, hey, we've got these procurement tools that could potentially save you time, et cetera. And so we've gone that route of, it's not necessarily our volume, but we've been trying to help our jurisdictions and our regional partners handle their own resource versus volume challenges as well.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer, I know piggybacking something that you're piggybacking.
Oh, I keep on hearing the recording button there.
That's my fault. I'm sorry. I'm technology challenged.
That's okay. Sorry, Rachel. Can you repeat that if you
No,
don't
you're,
mind?
you're fine. I have a voice that will never cut through the noise. It's okay. I was gonna say, I just know from our past conversations, you and I, you've leveraged the piggybacking vehicle as well. And when Mike was speaking to that for his team as like an optimization point, I was curious if you wanted to share how Barnstable's leveraged piggybacking.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, the big difference is that, I'm a department of 1. So I do anything that requires a sealed bid, I do for all of our internal departments. We have a decentralized system of buying. So, anything under that requires quotes, the departments usually handle. I monitor, make sure they're in compliance. And then otherwise we have the cooperative bids, like I said, for the 15 towns. The benefit that I've seen in the past years that communication between the groups and the towns have really increased. So we kind of have a better idea of what some of the towns are regularly going out to bid for. And I'm now hoping that in the next year, since we've been able to kind of implement some of these efficiencies and get rid of a lot of this administrative work, that we're going to be able to start introducing new cooperative contracts, which is kind of exciting because they've had kind of the same ones for the past few years. So I think there's a lot more opportunity out there. And unless, I think I've said this before, but unless the towns all of a sudden, all of them get a dedicated procurement person, or if I all of a sudden get staff, the resources are going to be the same. And then it's just, what can you do with the resources that you have? So that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, very key. And you highlighted before that I mentioned we go into, you had increased stakeholder involvement for the opportunities that your team is running. And Absolutely. How do you ensure consensus with, a higher volume of stakeholders and internal clients?
I feel like once I have their buy-in, they've loved the platform because they feel like communication is opened up. So, when a bid is open, they don't have to wait hours for me to scan everything in, put everything together. They're much more involved than they ever were before. And I think that has probably helped with a lot of the consensus. I haven't had too many RFPs, maybe 1 or 2 that I can think of that, our evaluations were completely off. But I feel that stakeholders being involved almost from the beginning where they kind of weren't before, has definitely helped that a lot.
Mm-hmm. Like that, no, that's a good point there. And when you say that by the beginning, are you alongside them in the scoping phase? Is that what
I mean, yeah. It's okay. Early on, and then, I'm uploading everything into Bonfire. They kind of get more of a sneak peek of what goes into the procurement. Previously, it would just kind of all be put together, and the next notification they got is when the bids came in. And that was it. So now they feel like they're part of the process and they have more buy-in. They know which vendors have picked up, have downloaded documents. They know which one of their local favorite vendors, if they have, downloaded their documents as well. So they actually become more involved and start contacting their vendors to get participation that way as well. So it's been great.
That's great. And what about for yourself, Mike? Jen highlighted, it's important for our stakeholders to be involved in sort of the formative phases. Is there anything, or how does your team essentially ensure consensus with more stakeholders?
So we have we're centralized in procurement, but our project managers, or our customers, I guess, our internal customers, they play a larger part of the role in ensuring that if there's multiple stakeholders. But it's similar to what Jennifer's saying, how we use Bonfire, how we allow people to be observers or technical advisors. It makes it really easy to give people access to the procurements or the process to see what's happening or where it's going. It's for the most part, I'd say 90 to 95% of our work that we do with our stakeholders, it just kind of works naturally, like everybody's in it for the same reason. There really aren't a lot of political or competing priorities. Some of our larger projects that span the whole region, it's challenging. I mean, we have a fair payment system that we use, like a fair payment card. And the next iteration of this system, I think we had a panel of maybe 25 plus scoring people, which were agencies throughout the area. Plus we had maybe 30 plus technical advisors. So it's like herding cats sometimes, but I just think it's communication and working with people.
Very fair. I mean, Omar, you're probably not unfamiliar to having to align and have maybe not, but somewhat democratic decision from an organization. I'm one of the people that tries to talk the loudest, but you have to obviously weigh other people's opinions at Bonfire. So is there any feedback you wanted to highlight relative to what Jen and Mike said from your own experience?
Yeah, I'll probably attack this one a little bit differently, but yeah, as you mentioned, a huge part of my role is to get alignment across different departments, stakeholders. And so I've noticed that I've had to adjust the way we run these types of meetings at Bonfire to ensure that we end up with the best decision. So the one thing that I learned very quickly, you have to be very deliberate with your communication. There's a lot of passive communication that happens randomly, whether you overhear something or you go for lunch and you get filled in on what's happening, that no longer takes place. So you have to be really deliberate about who gets information and who's looped in. Otherwise, people will feel out of the loop. And I think both Jen and Mike spoke about this, right? By having visibility for your own internal clients into the process, you're kind of passively looping them in, right? So I think that's happening naturally right now. The other thing I'll say tactically is I'm using kind of best practices in terms of meetings, setting an agenda ahead of time, sending it so people know what we're going to be talking about. With Zoom, it's very different than a live meeting in terms of the dynamic in the room and being able to read body language. So I'm very deliberate and kind of going around and making sure everybody has a say, so we can take everybody's into consideration. I will say there's been some democratization to the whole process, because I would imagine that the power dynamic in a live meeting room are very different than a Zoom meeting. It actually gives everybody an equal voice. That's probably a better thing to get consensus, whether it's a proper consensus meeting or just another meeting that we're having about procurement. Anyway, just some of the learnings that I've had to learn over the last few months.
Yeah, no, great points. We're actually going to move into a poll, and I'll comment on a couple as we launch this poll chat elements that just came in. So of course, if you could all take a moment, how would you best describe your vendor diversity strategy? So we're going to dive into this topic in a moment. And I will highlight, thank you, Gary and Marielle, I believe, for being very active in the chat. Gary giving some context to his, regional realities, for lack of a better explanation. On that note too, Marielle highlighted that she, would love to hear more stories and has loved them thus far about regional collaboration. So thank you for highlighting that, Marielle, and take that in consideration, Jen, Omar, and Mike, if there's any anecdotes you want to add on as we kind of continue today relative to regional collaboration. I will mention that in about 6 minutes, I'm just doing a little housekeeping here while the poll's open. There'll be 2 closing questions I'll have for the panelists, and I'm going to make sure we dive into, but then I will open up if there is any specific questions and at that moment in the buffer after for everyone in attendance today, so that we do end on time. So we're going to end the poll now, and let's see the results. So 35% have an established strategy with clear goals and a plan to meet them. That's fantastic. And I would say not thematically what we've noticed across our organizations. And I'm phrasing this delicately because I'm supporting Jen and Mike, and I don't want them, they represent like a greater body here of like established teams, but it is, many are scrambling. So that's fantastic to see. So those of you who do represent that 35%, feel free to share any tips or strategies or anything like that in the chat, because I think we can kind of have wisdom of the masses going on here. And then of course we do have in a close second somewhat, we believe our vendor diversity is important, but we don't have established goals and strategies. So we almost need to do like a matching here. There's a good kind of opportunity, I think, going forward. So thank you for sharing that poll, Justin. So we'll continue on into vendor diversity. So let's go forward, it's like oriented. So essentially, we did see, this is not 100% vendor diversity, the statistic I'm about to share with you, but I thought it was notable and we wanted to highlight it today, which is there was over 2 years, we did see in Bonfire's platform that there was a 202% increase in vendor invitations, direct vendor invitations to opportunities. So actually it averaged out to about 451 invitations per opportunity. So for some of you, that's great. For some of you, that's a bit unnerving because that may induce complexity and, you know, elongate timelines and opportunities. So I can understand there's mixed responses there. The assumption we're obviously making in sharing that statistic with yourselves is that a larger pool, you're likely going to have a more diverse representation. But people are welcome to kind of comment on that in the chat. So Michael, you were highlighting already your organization's intentionality around vendor diversity. So I'm going to make the assumption that it is a priority for your agency. And if you wanted to dive into any of the tactics and strategies of what your team is doing to action that priority.
Sure. I mean, some of it is dependent on the types of money or the color of money you get, right? Any federal money we receive is required to have a disadvantaged business enterprise program. So we have a whole programs that's set up. There's a goal setting process. And so federally funded, I'll set aside for a minute because you kind of have to. If you want to take federal money, you got to do it, right? Whether you're passionately invested in it or not, you kind of have to at least go through the motions. So for us, though, we've set up a whole separate program for everything that's not federally funded that tries to target small businesses and disadvantaged businesses. And it really is, it's the challenge becomes, though, is that for an agency that's not resourced, it's really hard because you can't say you're invested in diversity and roll out these programs, but not monitor and enforce them, because then they're just useless. Like so it's difficult. So what we've tried to do is to try to be self-aware of what our resources can support. And so when we get political pressure, our commissioners are saying, we want to expand small business participation, do this, do that. We always try to remind them that, monitoring and enforcement and enforcing compliance, it takes resources. And so we always try to balance out. So that's, I think, being self-aware. I just don't think it ever does an agency any good to have programs that they don't really enforce. Then you kind of lose credibility with the communities you're trying to help or the entities you're trying to help. But outside of that, just doing it. Sometimes there's paralysis by analysis. You think too much, you make it too big, you make it too challenging. So we started a pilot. First, we started with a pilot. We had an idea of what we wanted to do for a small business program, and we piloted it for a year. And then we proved that it could work, and we built up our processes to be able to manage it. And then it became a more fully developed program. And now we've expanded it and increased what it does. And so we're just taking kind of baby steps of how we're looking at, but we also, if your agency is in that where we want to make it more important or we want to roll out programs, looking at and learning from what other agencies are doing. We look at agencies around the country. I've been working with the Illinois Toll Authority of some programs they have for, there's these workforce development programs, and they're atypical, right? You're not your normal kind of sexy, we put a 30% DBE goal on a project. It's there's these programs where they hire and create apprenticeships to train construction or trade level work out of underserved communities. And then the Illinois Tollway has a program where they subsidize the hourly rates for contractors that agree to hire out of those programs. So there's a lot of different ways that you can achieve or try to make a positive impact without it actually being a goal or something major. So that would be my advice. Look at what your peers are doing in your region, look outside of your region, and there's a lot of good ideas that can be not require as many resources to manage the programs.
That's a great point. It's about moving the needle in general. Omar, is there anything anecdotal you wanted to share that you've seen from various strategies that our organizations have taken towards achieving their vendor diversity goals?
Yeah, I mean, we've had the opportunity to talk to many of our clients on this, and so I'll just share some of the ideas, and I think they vibe well with what Mike just mentioned. So one of our clients actually took a procurement professional who was on her team, and they became basically assigned with being the outreach person for DBEs. So like to facilitate the process for them, to make them well aware of the opportunities that exist, how to get access to them, just kind of pave the way for them. And the reason why it worked for that organization is because the person was a procurement person. So they knew all the ins and outs, and it wasn't just someone from outside the process talking about the process. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of one tip that I can maybe share that we've heard from before. The other thing that we learned, this is from New Jersey, is to actually evaluate what it takes to do business with the county or organization and make sure that's a really easy lift. So you're not having to fill out a paperwork and jump through a lot of hurdles. DBEs are disadvantaged, they don't have the resources that larger corporations do. And the last thing is obviously involving technology. And so there are ways that you can get more DBEs aware of the projects, and there's certainly tools available for that as well. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of some of the things that I've seen some of our clients do, and I'd love to dwell on them more. So if you have questions, let me know, and I'll follow up with you.
That's great. There's a very tactical question that I'll open up to Jen and Mike, and they can either of them are welcome to unmute and speak to it. Andrea spoke in the chat here, and I love that people already are commenting, because again, it doesn't have to be just the panelists answering these questions. And she was highlighting, when targeting DBEs, do you only count, vendor certified by the state? And context around her question too that she added, or color, I should say, is, the contact information available from the state is typically outdated and the emails bounce back. How have yourselves tackled this issue? They will reach out, but a lot of effort gets wasted because of the outdated information at the state level. So Jen or Mike, either of you want to comment on her question?
I'll comment first. I mean, I guess I'm just really lucky. We recently, for my, I'm the president of the Cape Cod Association for Public Procurement Officials, and our state supplier diversity office did a presentation. They have, I don't know if they've just really stepped up their game, but they have a, directory where you can search for any type of commodity, any type of vendor. If you have a vendor in mind and want to see if they're certified, if they're up to date. It's such a sophisticated system and such a good system that it's going to make it easier for municipalities and state agencies to be able to reach some of those goals. It's kind of a shame that as I'm reading some of the comments that, that Andrea's not having the same luck with that, but it's really up to your supplier diversity office to kind of facilitate that for you and make it a little bit easier to do business with some of these folks, because they go through such a long certification process, and then, then you can't reach them.
Well, if you don't mind, Rachel, I can jump into. So one of the things, so for our federally funded projects, we only allow DBEs certified by the state. For all of our other programs, we've expanded it to allow any firm, when they propose, to say that they're certified as a small business, or a variety of certifications that they can use, as long from like anywhere in the state of California, as long as there's a searchable database that I can verify that they actually have the certification. So that's one of the things, for one of the chat comments was that their state doesn't provide a very good system and is out of date. you could potentially explore using Bonfire's vendor registration if you use Bonfire or whatever procurement system you use. Sorry, I'm too big of a Bonfire fan, so that unbiased opinion of Omar. We use Bonfire. We have fields in Bonfire that allows a vendor to say their DBE or SBE or what is the certification. And you could potentially introduce rules within your procurement to say, register in Bonfire, tell me what your certification is and your certification number and where I can verify it, right? And then you can gather the information. We also, within our region, there's what they call the Business Outreach Committee, which is a group of agencies that do outreach to small and disadvantaged businesses. So there's resources, well, hopefully there's resources in whatever area you're in, but you can use Bonfire that way. And most, even like the state of California system has a lot of detail, but it's not very easy to use, but you can at least search by a company name or by a certification number. So if you can't rely on your state to provide you up-to-date information, you could potentially communicate with your communities around you. Hey, register in Bonfire, tell us where you're certified, and we can do some of the work to validate it.
That's great. I mentioned as well, thank you for the tips, both of you, Jen and Mike. And thank you for surfacing that question. I think we'll actually close out with one targeted question at both Jennifer and Mike that's a bit more retrospective, and then I'll have a different one for Omar that's a bit more futuristic. So for Jen and Mike specifically, if you were speaking to someone today who has a paper-based process or is semi-online, you can interpret that however you want, and they're interested in how to evolve and how to modernize, assume whatever it is resourcing wise on your end. And if they were to start anywhere, where would you recommend they start relative to your individual experiences, whether at your current organization in the past? So how about we start, no particular order, with yourself, Mike?
Yeah, again, I feel I need to disclose that I'm too big of a Bonfire fan. So take this for what you will. We have two separate softwares. We have Bonfire for our online procurement process, and we have a system called eContracts. It's like a SharePoint-based software for our database of our records and our workflow and all of that. The implementation of Bonfire, I think took 60 days. Like it was really easy to turn it on, use their training tools, whereas our other system, it took us 2 years to implement. So I think that would be my advice. I'm not saying it's Bonfire, but I would say do your research into the software tools that might help you take those first steps and pick the ones that are going to be easy to implement and stand up and get to work on. And then you can get some positive momentum. And then, like I was joking about earlier, then once your customers and stakeholders kind of get a taste of the difference between waiting for a stack of paper to move around versus having things on demand at your fingertips on your computer, now they want more. And so now you find more support, more funds, more resources to do more. But that when you're out looking for a procurement system, that would be one of the biggest questions I ask is, how hard is it to implement? How involved? How long does it take? What type of support do they give you, et cetera? But just pick one. I think one of the first ones we did was DocuSign. Just moving to electronic digital signatures, right? It almost forces you to not be in paper anymore. Like you got to deal with PDFs. So pick a low-hanging fruit, take the first step, and just kind of get some momentum building, and you'll find that I think you'll find that your stakeholders and your customers will want it.
No, that's great. How about yourself, Jen? Where do you recommend individuals start, organizations start?
I would recommend just thinking about the whole procurement process and try to identify ahead of time what potential issues and pushback there could possibly be. One of the big things I remember when I implemented it for the county was, well, what about the small mom and pop shops? Most of them know how to use computers, so it's not really that hard at this day and age. They have to use it for some of the other functions in their business. So they've been able to kind of embrace, e-procurement very quickly. If you can start to identify what sort of roadblocks you're going to have along the way, maybe it'll be a lot easier to kind of dismiss all of the possible excuses of not, doing it. I hate to piggyback, but Michael mentioned a lot of the low-hanging fruit. We started previously to this, like we had SharePoint for the longest time. We had Teams, we had all the systems in place. They just weren't being utilized as much as they are today, obviously. But the training was there, everything was there. So it started off with a lot of the low hanging fruit and a lot of small incremental changes to where we are today. So I think that was very helpful. We implemented DocuSign pre-COVID, SharePoint, OneNote, OneDrive, everything. So it was easy to kind of tackle it and, get everyone to embrace procurement and e-procurement, because it was kind of the next necessary step or next obvious step to go. So.
No, that's great. And I'm going to look at the chat in a moment. I fully acknowledge I'm going to go 5 minutes over. So unless anyone shuts me down, I will go 5 minutes over. Omar, what do you envision for the future of procurement? I'm going to give you a pretty heavy hitting answer, but you have the mic in the soapbox, so go for it.
Yeah, thanks. This is, if an IGP will have me back, I'll do like an hour presentation just on this. I've been doing a lot of thinking about this over the last few years. And I would say, broadly speaking, procurement will follow, the same modernization steps that we've seen with other core functions within an organization. And so imagine like cutting a check and how that was actually physically somebody had to cut a check. And that would just happen seamlessly and nobody thinks about that twice. I think a lot of the processes that are being done, like routine tasks, will be digitized through this kind of next generation, and people are doing that today. The next step will be leveraging, and I hate to throw in one more, hot jargon word nowadays, like machine learning, but there's a lot of power and potential that we're beginning to see for how you can deploy these types of tools, for example. And this is not something that we do, but there's something that others do, but machine learning for contract T&C reviews, and how does it match versus our own, and just to kind of alleviate some of the legal expenses and time that it takes to actually get a contract out. So this is the kind of stuff we'll see for procurement. One idea would be, imagine if when the supplier is writing a question in the Q&A, there's basically an algorithm that says that question was answered in page 6 of the RFQ document. Like, that's what we'll head towards, not imminently, but I would say in the next decade for sure. So they will digitize your process, but besides that, the next step will be, how do we leverage this data now that it's there to make really strategic data-driven decisions? How do we collaborate across organization boundaries? So all of these developments are gated by mass adoption of technology and procurement. So if you're thinking about making that move, you're actually helping kind of shape the future of procurement, because now we're enabling that data sharing and some of the cool stuff that will be done. Again, there's a lot more to talk about this, but we strongly believe procurement functions are strategic functions within the organization. They're being weighed down by a lot of processes that can be automated, and that will be more and more automated in the future. And the goal is to have the procurement person go out there and do the things that only humans can do. Better research, figuring out what the best contracting vehicle is, how to collaborate with others. All of that is done through human-to-human interaction, and that's what tools will alleviate you from having to do in the future.
Great. And for me to highlight as well, if many of you want to, just as we close off, continue your Monday afternoon talking about machine learning, I would encourage you to visit the Bonfire booth, and you and Omar can continue that dialogue. I will just highlight, we have the booth, so I really encourage yourselves to join. We have a 25-minute overview at 3:30. So if I let you out in time, which I will, you can attend that. We do have a 10-minute demo as well that you can join at any time of our open access community projects. I really wanted to highlight that's not, if you're a Bonfire like active client, you can access the community projects. Any of you can. So Gary, for example, you're not one of our organizations. You can access community projects if you want. You'll essentially have access to over 65,000 public procurement opportunities, whether it's RFPs, RFQs, various types of scope. So there's really a wisdom of the masses element we're trying to support there, because we've heard many times organizations that we serve directly asking us, do you have an organization that's run an RFP for this? Can I have their template? So that's what we're supporting with that. On that note too, the data and the feedback in the sense of like the bar graphs that you saw today, that's really a teaser for our holistic 2021 state of sourcing report. So you can get your full copy as well through the booth. So I really recommend going through there virtually. And again, as I close off today, I want to just say thank you again for the participation of those who joined today. Massive thank you to our panelists, Mike, Jennifer, and Omar, for taking this time to share your learnings authentically and honestly and sort of provide color for those who attended. It was really beneficial, and we'll have to continue the conversation in the future. Thank you all. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone, and we'll close it off here.
Thanks,
Bye.
Rachel. I too would like to thank our panel and the participants today. We had a great discussion. Do not forget to share your feedback with us by completing the evaluations for the sessions you attend. We look forward to seeing you in the expo hall beginning right now and later at our afternoon trivia party starting at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.